Basra, southern Iraq, September 19, 2005. The night smelled of diesel and river water, and something else underneath both of those things. The particular compound of dust and heat and close quarters human habitation that every soldier who served in southern Iraq eventually stopped noticing, and that returned to them years later with the completeness of a physical memory that the brain stores differently from ordinary recollection. It was 31 degrees at 2100 hours. It had been 41 degrees at noon. The Shatt al-Arab waterway, which divides Basra from its eastern approaches, and which the British Army's operational planners had noted in 2003 as a natural defensive feature of some significance, moved in the darkness beyond the city's eastern edge, indifferent to the question of what was about to happen on its western bank. What was about to happen had been building for 2 years, not in the dramatic sense of events that announce themselves as they accumulate, but in the quiet, structural sense of incompatibilities that take time to find the specific moment in which they become visible. Two of the most capable special operations units in the Western world had been operating in the same city, against the same networks, since the beginning of the occupation. They had a liaison process. They had a shared targeting board. They had liaison officers embedded on both sides whose specific job was to prevent the kind of collision that was, on the night of September 19, 2005, approximately 40 minutes from happening regardless. The British unit was D Squadron, 22nd Special Air Service Regiment, the regiment that had existed in its current form since 1950 and that had, in the decades between its founding and its deployment to southern Iraq, conducted operations in Malaya, Aden, Oman, the Falklands, Northern Ireland, the Gulf War, Bosnia, Sierra Leone, and Afghanistan, accumulating in each of those environments a specific kind of institutional knowledge that was not transferable through briefings or manuals, but that lived in the regiment's culture, in its selection process, in the particular judgment its operators brought to situations that had no established protocol. In Iraq, the regiment was operating under the designation Task Force Black, the British component of the coalition's special operations architecture. Working in Basra and southern Iraq, with a depth of human intelligence in the Shia communities that American forces had spent 2 years trying to match and had not fully matched, because the British approach to building local relationships was different from the American approach in ways that were more than stylistic. The American unit was 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta Force, operating under the designation Task Force Green. Delta Force had been established in 1977 at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, modeled in part on the SAS, and had by 2005 become something that its founders would have recognized in principle and been staggered by in practice. Under the command architecture that General Stanley McChrystal was building across Iraq, the intelligence-to-action machine that would eventually become the most sophisticated direct action organization in the history of special operations warfare, Delta Force in Basra was running multiple operations per week against the logistical and command networks of the militias that were responsible for the majority of attacks on coalition forces in southern Iraq. The machine required intelligence. It required speed. It required the ability to move from a piece of intelligence to a captured or eliminated target before that intelligence aged past the point of actionability. And it was in Basra in 2005, beginning to achieve that requirement with a consistency that the previous year's operations had not produced. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb had been in Basra for 112 days when the message arrived that changed the shape of September 19th. He was 34 years old. He had been in Delta Force for 6 years, having passed selection in 1999 after 3 years in the 75th Ranger Regiment. He had deployed to Afghanistan in 2001 and 2003, to an African country that his unit had officially never visited in 2002, and to Iraq for the first time in 2004. He was not the most senior operator in the Task Force Green Element in Basra, but he was the one whose assessments of the operational environment were most consistently sought by the officers above him. Because 11 years of high-stakes operational work had produced in him the particular quality of judgment that cannot be trained into a person, that is either developed through the accumulated weight of correct and incorrect decisions made under pressure, or it is not there. He understood Basra the way soldiers understand cities they have been required to care about for long enough that the caring becomes physical. In the specific way, the light moved through particular streets at particular times. In the quality of market activity on days when the ambient threat level had changed. In the difference between a checkpoint that was simply there and a checkpoint that was waiting for something. He was reading the intelligence package for the evening's planned operation when the British liaison officer came through the door with the expression of a man who was carrying a problem he had not yet decided how to frame. The operation concerned a man the intelligence picture had designated Cardinal. The real history of the targeting effort against this specific node in the Basra IED network. The Jaish al-Mahdi-affiliated logistics coordinator, whose name does not appear in any publicly released document and whose designation here reflects the standard practice of American targeting operations in Iraq, had taken 3 weeks to develop to the point where the JSOC targeting process was satisfied that action was warranted. The intelligence came from 3 convergent streams. Signals intelligence characterizing a pattern of communication activity consistent with pre-operational coordination. Human reporting from 2 separate sources whose access to the relevant network had been assessed independently. And 11 days of pattern-of-life surveillance on a specific residential location in the Hayaniyah district of northwestern Basra. The Hayaniyah district was, by September 2005, one of the areas of the city most thoroughly controlled by Jaish al-Mahdi, the militia that Muqtada al-Sadr had built from the dispossessed Shia poor of Baghdad and Basra, and that had, since the April 2004 uprisings in Najaf and Sadr city that killed over 1,000 people, established itself as the primary armed force challenging British authority in southern Iraq. Cardinal's specific function within this network was the movement of IED components and, more recently, the Iranian-manufactured explosively formed penetrators, the copper-lined devices that the Defense Intelligence Staff had been tracking with increasing urgency since they first appeared in attacks on coalition vehicles in late 2004. The EFP was a weapon of a different category from the standard pressure plate IED. It could defeat the armor of the Snatch Land Rover that British forces were still, controversially, deploying in 2005. And it had already been responsible for multiple British fatalities in Basra that year. The intelligence picture traced the devices to Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps supply chains running through the border crossing at Shalamcheh. And the logistics network that Cardinal was coordinating was one of the distribution points through which the devices moved from the border into the city. Webb had briefed the mission package to the Task Force Green Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Gallagher, the previous evening. Gallagher had approved execution for the night of September 19th and had directed the British liaison process to be notified. The notification had gone out on the morning of the 18th. The response had come back 18 hours later through the warrant officer designated as SAS liaison to Task Force Green. And it contained information that was going to make the evening considerably more complicated than the targeting package had suggested. The warrant officer's name was Ashworth. He had been the liaison to Task Force Green for 4 months and had developed in that time a working relationship with Webb and Gallagher that was functional in the specific way that relationships between Allied Special Operations units become functional, built not on warmth, though there was some of that, but on the accumulated experience of each side learning what the other side actually meant when it said specific things in specific ways. Ashworth had listened to the Delta briefing on Cardinal with the particular quality of attention that Webb had come to associate with a man tracking information against a context he was not yet sharing. When the briefing concluded, there was a pause before Ashworth spoke that was not long in clock time, and that was in the specific register of these two men's professional relationship. A very long time. "We have a coordination issue," Ashworth said. The British use of the word coordination to describe situations that an American officer might describe as a catastrophic intelligence conflict was one of the cultural divergences that the liaison process existed to translate. And Webb was experienced enough to hear both meaning simultaneously. "How serious?" Webb said. "The individual you're designating Cardinal," Ashworth said, "has been in contact with Task Force Black for 11 weeks. Not as a target." The silence that followed this statement lasted several seconds and contained within it the complete unfolding of implications that anyone who understood how intelligence operations worked in complex coalition environments would have recognized immediately. The man that Delta Force had spent 3 weeks developing as a target whose location had been confirmed through multiple independent intelligence streams, whose capture had been assessed as operationally significant, whose exploitation was expected to produce leads to more significant targets, was simultaneously an active source for the British intelligence operation running in the same city. This was not, in the history of coalition intelligence operations in Iraq, a unique situation. The Chilcot Inquiry, published in 2016, documented extensively the degree to which British and American intelligence operations in Iraq operated in parallel rather than in genuine coordination, sharing products selectively while protecting sources and methods from each other with the same institutional instinct they used to protect them from adversaries. The compartmentation that kept British sources from American awareness and American sources from British awareness was not a failure of the liaison process. It was the liaison process functioning as designed by organizations whose fundamental instinct was to protect what they had built from any external access that could not be fully controlled, including access by allies. The result, in Basra in September 2005, was that 2 allied organizations had been running parallel intelligence operations against the same network for months, had developed independently acquired access to some of the same individuals, and had no systematic mechanism for discovering this until one of them was preparing to conduct a direct action mission against a man the other had been carefully cultivating. Webb called Gallagher. Gallagher's response was the response of a commander who had been in enough coalition operations to understand that the British were not delivering bad news so much as they were delivering accurate news that happened to be bad. He asked the questions that defined the actual stakes. "How deep is he?" Gallagher said. "And what has he produced?" The answer came not through Ashworth but directly from the Task Force Black commanding officer, a lieutenant colonel named Forsyth, who called Gallagher personally within the hour. The decision to make that call directly, bypassing the normal liaison process, was itself a communication. It meant that Forsyth regarded what was happening as significant enough to require the kind of conversation that only the principals could have. Forsyth was a 14-year veteran of the SAS, who had deployed to Iraq twice before this tour. His operational record was the kind that the regiment does not publicize, and that can only be inferred from the assignments that were publicly acknowledged and the gaps between them where things happened that were not publicly acknowledged. He had built, in 7 months in Basra, a source network that the British intelligence community assessed as one of the more significant assets in the coalition's southern Iraq operation. The network had contributed to 3 confirmed operations against the Basra IED supply chain. It had produced intelligence that the Defense Intelligence Staff had assessed as Grade B reliable source, probably true on Iranian supply routes. It was, by any professional measure, exactly the kind of patient, methodical intelligence architecture that the SAS had developed the institutional capacity to build over decades of similar work in similar environments. Cardinal was a node in that network, not the most significant node, but connected through relationships that the British had spent 11 weeks mapping to sources who were more significant. Forsyth told Gallagher this directly and told him what it meant, that pulling Cardinal on the timeline Delta Force had established would end those relationships in ways that could not be reversed. Because the trust that sources in networks like this placed in the people running them was not transferable and not recoverable once the organization protecting you had demonstrated that it could not protect you from the people who were supposed to be on your side. "How long do you need?" Gallagher asked. 3 weeks, Forsyth said. "Minimum. We can transition him out in a way that protects the access he represents. But not in 48 hours. The silence that followed was the silence of 2 professional military officers processing the same information against institutional responsibilities that were genuinely incompatible. It was the silence that coalition warfare produces when it is functioning correctly. Not the silence of failure, but the silence of 2 correct positions that happen to point in opposite directions. Gallagher asked for 12 hours. Forsyth gave them. The 12 hours produced no middle course. This was not for lack of trying. The officers on both sides who spent those 12 hours looking for a middle course were experienced and creative and genuinely motivated to find one. But the middle course would have required either Delta Force to accept a 3-week delay on an intelligence window that had a 48-hour shelf life, or Task Force Black to accept a 48-hour transition for a source whose relationships represented months of cultivation. Neither was an acceptable risk within the institutional framework of the organization being asked to accept it. The middle course did not exist because the gap between the 2 positions was not a gap that process could bridge. It was a gap between 2 different answers to the same question, which was, when British and American intelligence priorities conflict in a coalition operation, whose priority takes precedence? That question had no agreed answer in September 2005. It does not have a fully agreed answer now. Gallagher made his decision and called Forsyth. He told him the Delta mission would proceed that night. He told him the decision had been made by the JSOC chain of command with full knowledge of the British position. He told him he respected Forsyth's assessment and disagreed with the conclusion it led to. Because the American evaluation of the intelligence window and the operational requirements produced a different judgment about acceptable risk. He told him Task Force Green would provide maximum advance notice and share the tactical plan for British deconfliction. He did not ask for British approval. British approval was not something his chain of command required, and asking for something in those circumstances would have been a form of dishonesty about what he was doing. Forsyth said that Task Force Black would not participate in the operation. He said British operations in the Hayaniyah district would be suspended for 48 hours post-mission. He said he required a full exploitation debrief within 72 hours. And he said, with the precision of a man who wanted his institutional position on the record, that Task Force Black regarded the operation as an unnecessary risk to a functioning British intelligence operation, and that this view would appear in the British after-action documentation. He said this without anger. The absence of anger was, in Webb's assessment of what he observed from Gallagher's side of the call, more communicative than anger would have been. Anger meant the relationship could be repaired, with an apology and time. The absence of anger meant the British were simply documenting a structural problem and would continue working within it because the alternative was worse. The call ended at 20:47 hours. The operation launched at 1:30 hours on September 20th. The Hayaniyah district at 1:30 hours was what Basra's contested neighborhoods were at that hour, not silent, because Basra was never silent, but operating at a frequency that was different from its daytime frequency, in ways that the two assault vehicles moving through it from the staging point registered as a change in background rather than a change in presence. The generators ran. A dog tested the air somewhere to the north and found nothing it wanted to announce. The drone at altitude painted a thermal picture of the objective that matched the pattern of life analysis with the specific fidelity that suggested the surveillance period had been long enough to establish what normal looked like. The assault team moved on foot from the vehicle drop point. 14 operators, divided into breach element and outer cordon, carrying the specific physical and psychological load of a direct action mission in a neighborhood where the ambient threat was not zero and the tactical margin for error was narrow. Webb was with the outer cordon. His role that night was not the breach, but the management of what happened outside the building during the breach, which was the role that required the most continuous judgment and the least defined procedure, and which experienced operators generally handled better than younger ones. The breach lasted 40 seconds. The building contained 5 individuals. Cardinal was in the rear room, which the imagery had assessed as likely. He did not resist. He was detained within 90 seconds of the breach element's entry. He looked at the American operators with the expression of a man who is not surprised, who has, somewhere in the previous weeks, calculated this as a possibility and has arrived at whatever internal accommodation a man in his position arrives at when the possibility becomes real. He was 31 years old. He had a phone and a set of documents and a mind full of information that the JSOC exploitation system was designed to extract and process and act on before it aged. The exploitation took 22 minutes. The team was in the vehicles and moving by 2:17 hours. No shots fired, no coalition casualties, no civilian casualties. By the measures that tactical execution is measured, the operation was clean. What it had cost was not visible in those measures. The British network began showing the effects within 48 hours. 2 sources that Task Force Black had been developing through access that ran through Cardinal's associations went quiet, not dark, which would have suggested compromise, but quiet in the way that sources go quiet when they have recalculated the risk environment and found it less favorable than they previously assessed. The British intelligence officers running those relationships had seen this pattern before, in Northern Ireland and in previous Iraq rotations, and they understood what it meant. It meant that word of Cardinal's detention had moved through the network in the way that information about detained individuals always moved through networks composed of people who knew each other and who updated their assessments of their own vulnerability based on what happened to people they were connected to. The access those sources represented was not immediately recoverable. The months of cultivation that had gone into building those relationships, the specific trust that is the only currency intelligence sources accept, had been spent in a way that the organizations who had spent it had not chosen and could not reverse. At the same time, the Cardinal exploitation product was moving through the JSOC processing system and producing results. The phone contained a contact network that mapped 18 nodes the targeting picture had not previously located. The documents contained operational detail on 3 specific logistical routes. 2 operations executed in the 4 weeks following the Hayaniyah mission drew directly on this product. Both produced outcomes the targeting process assessed as significant. The network that Cardinal had coordinated was degraded in specific, measurable ways that the intelligence assessment attributed to the exploitation of his capture. Both of these things were true. They did not cancel each other out. They existed simultaneously in the operational picture of a coalition, conducting a war in a complex environment against an adaptive adversary. And the relationship between them was not one that could be resolved into a clean answer about whether the night of September 19th had been worth what it cost. Because worth and cost were being measured against different things by different organizations, applying different institutional standards to the same event. The joint debrief took place within the 72-hour window Forsyth had specified. Both commanding officers attended. The intelligence products were shared fully. The British assessment of the network damage was presented with the same precision as the American assessment of the exploitation value. The meeting produced the kind of honest institutional accounting that coalition operations occasionally manage when the professionals involved are experienced enough to examine a failure, or the thing that looks like a failure and also looks like a success, depending on which part of it you are measuring, without either defending their own position past the point of accuracy or conceding more than the facts required. It also produced, at the end of the formal agenda, an exchange that both Gallagher and Forsyth recorded in their respective after-action notes as the most significant thing to come out of the debrief, which was the acknowledgement, made directly and without institutional language, that the coordination process had failed not because anyone had done their job incorrectly, but because the process had not been built to share the specific kind of information, source identity, source access, the shape of an ongoing intelligence operation that would have prevented the collision. The process shared targeting products. It did not share the architecture behind the products. The architecture was what mattered, and the architecture was what neither side's institutional culture permitted to be shared as a default. The after-action reports were filed separately. The lessons were recorded in separate institutional archives. The joint lessons learned process produced genuine procedural improvements that both sides implemented. It also produced the comfortable fiction that productive lessons learned processes always produce, which is the fiction that identifying and recording what went wrong is equivalent to preventing it from going wrong again. When what actually happened was that the specific process that produced the collision had been adjusted without changing the fundamental incentive structure that would, in different operational circumstances, produce a different version of the same collision. The SAS and Delta Force continued to operate in Basra. The coordination was better after September 2005 than before it. The structural tension between the British intelligence-first culture, built on the specific experience of Northern Ireland, where a burned source sometimes meant a body, where patience was not a preference but an operational necessity, and the American direct action tempo culture, built on the JSOC architecture that McChrystal was refining in real time, that prioritized speed and network exploitation and would prove, in Fallujah and Ramadi and Mosul in 2006 and 2007, to be one of the most effective military innovations of the post-Cold War period, did not resolve because the processes were refined. It persisted, as structural tensions between genuine institutional philosophies persist, in the background of every joint operation. Managed well on most days, and producing friction on the days when it was not managed well, which is the normal condition of coalition warfare rather than the exception. The 2016 Chilcot Inquiry into the Iraq War, the most comprehensive public examination of British decision-making in the conflict, documented the intelligence coordination failures between British and American forces in terms that confirmed, in the sanitized language of public inquiry, what the men who were there experienced in the specific and unsanitized reality of that language's reference. The inquiry found that British and American intelligence sharing in Iraq was systematically incomplete, that each nation protected its sources and methods from the other with the same institutional reflexes it used to protect them from adversaries, and that the coordination mechanisms that existed were designed to manage this incompleteness rather than to resolve it. The inquiry's conclusions were read by officials in London and Washington and filed in the appropriate archives and referenced in subsequent policy discussions, and did not change the fundamental incentive structure that produced the incompleteness. Because the incentive structure was not a policy failure, but an institutional instinct that predated any specific policy and would outlast any specific reform. Webb completed his deployment in December 2005. He filed his after-action contribution 3 weeks before he left, working through the standard framework and finding, as he always found with operations that were more complicated in their implications than in their execution, that the framework was most useful as a starting point, and that the most important things he needed to record were precisely the ones that the framework had not been designed to capture. He wrote about the coordination failure in terms that reflected what he had observed, that neither the British nor the American position had been wrong, and that the collision had been produced by the interaction of two systems, each functioning as designed, without either having been designed with sufficient attention to what happened when they functioned simultaneously in the same operational space. He wrote about the dual reality of the cardinal exploitation, the intelligence value produced, and the network access lost, without resolving the duality in favor of either outcome. Because the honest answer was that both were real, and he did not know whether a different decision would have produced a better combined result, because a different decision was not the decision that had been made, and the counterfactual was not available. The most difficult paragraph to write, the one he returned to 4 times before arriving at language that felt accurate, was about what the night revealed about the nature of the alliance that the British and American Special Operations Forces were supposed to represent. He wrote that the alliance was real. He had operated with SAS soldiers on 3 continents and in 5 separate classified programs, and had never once had cause to doubt that they were, in the most important sense of the word, on the same side. He wrote that the alliance being real did not mean the alliance was frictionless, and that frictionless was not actually a condition that a genuine alliance between 2 sovereign nations with different histories and different institutional cultures could achieve or should be expected to achieve, because the friction was not a malfunction of the alliance but an expression of it, an expression of the fact that both nations brought different things to the partnership, and that the different things sometimes pointed in different directions, and that the professional management of those directional conflicts was what the alliance actually looked like in the operational spaces where it lived. The coordination improvements implemented in the aftermath of the Hayaniyah operation were real and made subsequent joint operations measurably more effective. The SAS and Delta Force conducted multiple joint operations in Basra in the 12 months that followed September 2005 that were, by the assessments of the officers who planned and executed them, significantly better coordinated than the operations that preceded the collision. The structural tension that had produced the collision was still there. It was managed better. This is what coalition warfare actually is, in the operational spaces that are invisible to the public record, and that constitute the overwhelming majority of what coalition warfare contains. Not the moments of declared solidarity and bilateral agreements and joint press conferences. The friction. The phone calls between commanding officers who respect each other and disagree with each other simultaneously, who are required by their respective institutional responsibilities to make decisions that the other side regards as wrong, who make those decisions and then continue working with each other because the alternative is worse, and both sides understand that the alternative is worse. The management of ongoing incompatibility by professionals who are good enough at their jobs to keep the incompatibility from becoming catastrophic. The Hayaniyah mission did not become catastrophic. The alliance held. The British network recovered partially over the months that followed. The Delta exploitation product contributed to operations that degraded the Basra IED network in ways that were real if not permanent. The coordination improvements that both sides implemented reduced the likelihood of a precise recurrence. What did not recover, and what no coordination improvement was designed to address, was the specific knowledge that lived in the men who had been there. The knowledge of what it meant to be on the right side of a decision that still cost something. To have done your job correctly within the standards your institution set, and to watch the outcome arrive in a form that the institutional standards had not accounted for. To understand that the friction was structural and therefore permanent, and that the best available response to permanent structural friction was professional management rather than resolution, which was a true answer and an unsatisfying one, and the only one the situation actually offered. Forsyth completed his tour and returned to the United Kingdom. The network he had built continued under a successor who learned the ground and rebuilt what had been damaged with the patient, methodical consistency that the British approach required. Webb deployed to Iraq again in 2007, to a different part of the country under a different operational architecture, and found that the coordination between British and American Special Operations Forces had improved in the ways that the post-2005 reforms had been designed to improve it, and had retained the structural tension that the reforms had not been designed to address. The alliance continues. The structural tensions continue within it. The management of those tensions by the professionals who are paid to manage them continues. The men who were in Basra on September 19, 2005 continue, in the sense that all the men who survive their wars continue, carrying in the specific weight of their operational memory the knowledge of what the alliance cost that night and what it was worth, and the honest uncertainty about whether those two things ever fully balance, which is a question that professional soldiers who have been in coalition operations long enough to know both sides of it tend not to answer definitively. Because the honest answer is that it depends on what you are counting and how. They know what they are counting. They do not always agree on how. The river ran, the city continued. The night became the past, which is what nights always become, and the past became the operational experience that shaped subsequent decisions, which is what operational experience is for. And the subsequent decisions shaped subsequent outcomes, which is what decisions are for, and the outcomes accumulated into the record of a coalition that was real and imperfect and costly and, by the measures that matter most, still there, which is, in the end, what alliances are for.